Hello everyone, welcome to episode 4 of the Athlete Branding Podcast. Today I'm joined by Isobel Carnwath over at IMMAF. She works in media and communications over there, so it's going to be a great little podcast to talk to particularly the grassroots athletes within the sport of mixed martial arts about how you can build your profile, how you can build an audience, and how you can monetize your image. And we're going to talk a little bit about how you can capitalize on that exposure, how you can capitalize on the content opportunities from competing at IMMAF, as well as obviously the opportunities it gives you as a fighter, and obviously the great experience that these competitions give to young fighters. So thank you very much for your time today. I truly appreciate it. I'm sure you're incredibly busy. So thank you for being here. So we'll start off with you just telling us a little bit about your background in the sport, how you got into it, and what you've done before working for IMMAF.
Hi there, thank you for having me on the podcast. I've been working in MMA comms for about 10 years now. So originally it started in quite a grassroots way. I had a friend who was a fighter and she wanted help promoting herself. She wanted help getting sponsorship and getting matches. And I worked very tightly with her, and we built up a campaign around her debut fight. And from that, at the time, her first fight was with UCMMA, former Cage Rage, and through that I came close with the comms person for UCMMA, and we started sort of developing a sort of partnership around sort of dedicated MMA PR, and there wasn't a dedicated agency for UK PR at the time, and that was very kind of successful for a period of time. We took on a number of UFC fighters and Bellator fighters, and we got the contract with BAMMA, which was a kind of new promotion at the time. And kind of following that period, I ended up going in-house at BAMMA, and that became a full-time role. And so I guess what I found overall was with MMA, because it was so grassroots in the UK, and it was growing so fast that there were more kind of opportunities in more areas. So such a kind of growing beast that I ended up, I had my own business previously, but MMA was just growing so much faster that I ended up kind of moving sideways into that. And from BAMMA, there being kind of gaps in a lot of the kind of governance areas in the sport, there being no governance in the UK, I helped found Safe MMA, which is the medical charity here that independently audits medical records for certain promotions, and therefore provides a kind of level of governance. And it was through that I got onto IMMAF's radar, and was contacted to do some bit work for them, and then to work on the 214 World Championships, which was the inaugural amateur World Championships under IMMAF. So that was my journey into the world of international mixed martial arts.
Yeah, so a whole wealth of experience, and it's quite interesting even in the sport in the UK, since it was sort of really started booming, obviously in the last probably 5 or 6 years or so. It has as well. It's still probably the fastest growing sport in the world, perhaps with the exception of esports, some might argue. So yeah, it's interesting you got that experience of doing this kind of thing from the early days and seeing how it's adapted to now. Obviously, social media presents a lot of new opportunities for fighters to develop some commercial opportunities for themselves, which is what almost all fighters want, even the ones at the top, but particularly the ones at the bottom, because fighter pay is still a little bit of an issue. I think it's still, MMA is still kind of teething a little bit in the sort of lower ranks. That a lot of lower rank fighters can't really sustain themselves because there is perhaps a lot of a disproportionate amount of attention on the UFC, some might say. So yeah, it's great that I think you obviously spotted that little gap in the market to go and help some fighters with developing their commercial opportunities. So when you went to IMMAF then, when it was still new, what were the sort of main goals of what it was trying to achieve? What obviously is something that's completely different. So what was the sort of rationale behind what they were doing?
Well, IMMAF came on the scene in 2012, and it was because it was identified that there's actually no global governance for MMA. So most sports will have some governing body. Now, whether it's legally enforced in a country or not, it's a different matter. But obviously you've got FIFA, you have the ITA, and so on, that set standards globally for the sport. And that's not just at the elite level and the Olympic level, but you're also kind of looking at from the grassroots up, like what happens when a kid goes into a gym, what kind of child safeguarding is there, what kind of medical standards are there, fair play standards, anti-doping, and so on and so forth. So there was that, and also really to promote the positive elements of mixed martial arts as a martial art and as a credible elite sport, because in so much of Europe and parts of the world, it's had this really sort of tawdry image of being kind of cage fighting, and I guess it's led to kind of an exclusion of athletes and its participants. So, you know, when you have doctors who don't want to see fighters because they're frightened to get involved, they don't think it's a sport, and there's lots of other areas in terms of sponsorship and so on where the doors are closed to athletes, so they don't get the rights they would have in other sports, and not just athletes, just your children in the gym and other people participating. So that there's a kind of big there's a big kind of drive towards some kind of, I guess, social responsibility around the sport, which is where the UFC kind of stepped in to sponsor IMMAF at the beginning. And the launch really kind of grew out of a Swedish initiative, the Swedish Mixed Martial Arts Federation, which is legally recognised in Sweden. And any promoter who goes to Sweden has to go through that federation. Every gym in Sweden is licensed with them. And that was established as the result of a lobby against a proposed ban in Sweden of the sport. So after the successful development of that and the UFC's relationship with the Swedish Mixed Martial Arts Federation, from going over there, holding events, it was off the back of that that our Swedish board directors kind of proposed the idea and canvassed for the support of an international federation.
Yeah, it's incredibly important that the sort of outside perception of mixed martial arts needs to change. I mean, I remember when I was still in secondary school and they were looking for some new sport initiatives to bring into the school, and they said, does anyone do any sports that are kind of a little bit obscure, that aren't perhaps that common? And I kind of raised my hand, like, yeah, I do. And they went, nah, we're not. They didn't want to touch it. And we've got one of the most world-class coaches that you could find, especially in the country, on our doorstep in Gloucester, a 10-minute walk from the school. They don't want to go anywhere near it. And it's quite sad, really, because I know a lot of people who it's helped come from perhaps not great backgrounds and turn their lives around, and it gives them a sense of discipline and a sense of learning. And even I remember Nathaniel Wood over in London, Brad Pickett's guy, he, I think, wanted to make a donation to a children's hospital, but they actually rejected it because he was in the UFC. I don't know if you remember that, but
Pretty sad.
It's, you know, these are all normal guys, are all athletes, most of them are family men, and it's sad that people still have that sort of perception of the sport, because you can sort of see why some people might look at it that way, but it's a shame that people choose to sort of remain ignorant to what it does and the positive benefits of it, when, especially when most people don't have any issue with boxing, really, which I would argue is probably worse health-wise. But yeah, it's two guys volunteering to go in and fight each other. So really, there isn't any ethical issue that I see. And like I said, there's plenty of positive benefits to it. So it's great that IMMAF are obviously helping out take the sport forward, because it's about time it did. And it's still a relatively young sport. I think about 26, 27 years old, I think the UFC is now. So you kind of expect to have these issues, but what speaks to me is the fact that MMA has grown so quickly, particularly in the last few years. I mean, virtually no one knew what it was when I started training 5 or 6 years ago. And now literally, or virtually everyone does. I've not met someone in the last 2 or 3 years who hasn't heard of Conor McGregor. And I think that's probably largely down to social media, because social media gives people a voice and it allows people to share and put content in front of new eyeballs. That when you have these little viral McGregor moments, just as an example, it then exposes people to the sport. And I think a lot of people now understand what MMA is. They understand the difference between MMA and UFC. So I think there's definitely been a huge amount of progress in the last few years, and particularly with governing bodies and IMMAF, and hopefully more sort of health initiatives and charitable initiatives to help fighters, and especially younger kids as well. It's definitely taken the sport a step in the right direction. So what my next question would be then, now that IMMAF have made their way into the sport, they've changed the way it works to some extent, and now you're running these events, these continental championships or these world championships, how does the sport of MMA and athletes in particular capitalize on the exposure it gives them? I know it's very difficult at times because you have hundreds of fighters per tournament, But if you are one of the fighters who perhaps gets to the semi-finals or to the final in your weight class, how do you think they can then capitalize on this exposure to create conversations, to bring themselves some attention, to perhaps monetize their image better, to perhaps accelerate their career?
I think what would help to a huge degree is it's actually what happens before they come to IMMAF in those run-up weeks. So we have sometimes up to 400 athletes or more on our events, and often because it's tournament format, we don't always know who's going to be fighting at those events till a number of weeks before. We don't have the complete list, so that there's a lot of exposure IMMAF can give at the event itself, and afterwards we can obviously celebrate the different medalists and tell their stories. But often, particularly the athletes who we've not had before, if they're not a return medalist, where our focus is going to be in the run-up to that event, or they've got a really kind of standout story that their federation has highlighted, then they're not actually going to get any kind of promotion from IMMAF in the run-up. And that's when they actually would benefit from generating some PR, because that's how they can get sponsorship and funding to go to the events where the government isn't funding their team. So I think that there's real key basics that I strongly recommend that every athlete who's got their kind of first fight, whether it's on IMMAF or even if it's a professional promotion. And just again, touching on professional promotions, working in BAMMA for a long time, again, you have sort of 30 guys on the card, and there's a very limited amount of media space available, and that's going to really go on the guys on the top of the card. So guys going on to the professional shows at entry level or lower down the card are facing the same issues, that there's not going to be so much PR around them. So I think the first thing they can do to really help themselves is actually getting some professional photos done, certainly for the professional shows as well, because with the professional shows where you've got poster artwork going out, you'll see that with the guys who aren't so well known, you've got terrible pictures, haven't you, of them, some are really kind of low grade, or perhaps there isn't even an image the PR can actually use. Sometimes the promotion, if it's a small promotion, is not going to spend money on photographing the guys on the undercard. So you can really help yourself by getting a professional set of portrait photos, especially on a green screen if you can. And then that's automatically going to get you more exposure, because one, the promoter, is more easy for them to promote you, and two, then you've got pictures as well that you can send to press and so on. A lot of press won't run stories without a picture, so it's just a really, really basic tool. It might, cost a couple of £100 or something to get a professional shoot, but I would say if you're somebody who's a career fighter, then it's and you're really ambitious about moving up the card, I would really recommend you find a way to do that, get some sponsorship to do that at some stage early on. As you've touched on, establishing social media profiles and polished looking social media profiles. So if they've got that nice picture they've had taken, those nice portrait shots, and they've got a very kind of clear bio, and don't worry about going to, it could be the PR on a promotion, it could be friends, could be anybody else who to read over your profile. Does it look professional? Is everything correctly spelled? Does it look polished? And then updating people about your journey. So I think, George, you were talking about, really, really kind of useful, colourful stories that athletes could be telling on their social as well. And those are the stories that nobody's going to tell your story like you can until you're higher up on the card, or until you've got a medal, or you're fighting the main guy. So to tell your own story, really do. And I think what's always been helpful to PRs as well is when you've got fighters who are willing to work with you and they want to work with you. So there's so many times, even guys on the top of a fight card, and you're putting together a press story, you're putting together a press release, and you'll say, okay, can you give me a comment on your fight? Can I have a quote? And some people just either don't want to react or to engage because they feel their focus should be on fighting. They're really purists. They kind of think, this isn't my job to do this. But other guys might just say, we'll always come up with a cliche, I talk with my hands, I'll see him in the cage. And we keep getting this quote again and again. It's like, I can't do anything with that. So do try and, it's not easy, obviously, fighters aren't professional PRs, but do try and generate your own story, or engage, or put some thought to it, even if it's kind of getting on the phone to the PR or to the promoter. I remember when I first started working with Luke Barnett, who obviously is kind of ex-UFC now, and he's probably the most kind of proactive fighter PR wise I've ever met. He kind of writes his own interviews and send them to me and say, right, publish this, or you kind of phone off and really kind of drive the narrative. I want to fight this guy. You start calling people out on Twitter saying, I'm going to fight this guy, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this. But he really kind of controlled that. He's got a Jehovah's Witness background, so he's obviously very used to like marketing and selling. But other guys will be messaging saying, where's my PR? Why aren't you promoting me? And then if I've got the space, for me that's happened to me in the past, and the same for other people, you're more likely to kind of reach to those people first because you know you can work with them, whereas the people who probably sit back quietly or think it's not their job, they're kind of more likely to be overlooked when you've got a volume of fighters and limited exposure opportunities. So I think, you know, whoever shouts loudest is good, you know, and promoters love that. You know, that they love people who want to be promoted. So I would say those are the kind of key basics, but they can also as well, in the run up to a fight, actually getting a story with local media. It's getting more difficult now. They're more under-resourced, but actually getting something in your local paper, and if you've got pictures, that will enable it, or trying to get a blog on a local news website, you know, the local kind of Sheffield news paper, or with an MMA blog site that you know that you'd like to kind of get your diary or vlog or whatever on there. Not everybody's a writer. That's appreciated. Some people can do that, but it might be, as you say, with kind of video logs or just calling and trying to push your story. You won't get everywhere, but I think for our sort of 400 or 500 athletes who come to IMMAF, I'm not going to reach every local news desk in their area, but that local news and those small blog sites will help them get that kind of lower tier sponsorship in the first place, which if they build up a few pieces of sponsorship can help them pay their way to the event. So yeah, I guess we're asking them to put in some kind of graph, really. It's like the more you put in, the more you get out until you're higher up the ladder.
Yeah, it obviously is very difficult for promotions to prioritise who they're going to promote. I think it's probably easiest for the UFC now that they have Fight Pass, and the UFC creates so much great content on its own, but because it's behind a paywall on Fight Pass, I actually don't think it's as effective as it should be. I think they should actually completely demonetize it. And I had a little theory about this on my last podcast. I'll talk in more depth about that in a minute, because there's lots of great points that you mentioned I want to touch upon. But as you said, just even having a picture, marketing is just an eyeballs game. First thing, before you actually build an audience, is you have to make people aware of you. And if you don't have a picture, then it's going to make it very difficult for people to remember who you are. And the guys who show how they're different are the ones who always win. So Sean O'Malley, for example, he's a great fighter, but he was fighting, I think, not co-main, but I think he was on the main card when he fought Chito Vera. He probably wouldn't have been that high up the card if he hadn't done such a great job of promoting himself. And obviously he was on Contender Series, which had a lot of attention, but he looks different. He's on Twitch. He's great in media. He does a lot with Brendan Sharp. Just he's so good at putting himself out there and cutting through noise, because he has so much content of his own and takes his voice to other outlets where he can also gain exposure. And as you said, in IMMAF, again, it's very difficult for you to prioritize who you're going to promote. So obviously Mohammed Makayev is probably one of them, who was an easy one to promote because he obviously has such a great story, but he's also so successful in IMMAF and now gone pro. He's all over BBC all of the time. I think he's well over 150,000 followers on Instagram. And he was at that before he even went pro, which is completely unprecedented for an amateur fighter. It's absolutely insane. It absolutely baffles me how he's done it, but he has. Yeah, go ahead.
And I think Mohammed is absolutely exceptional, and he's generated a lot of that press also for himself. So I would say that he's absolutely standout, and it is his talent, it is his drive, and he's completely focused on those areas. I would say those for people who are kind of less extrovert and don't have the sport around them that Mokayev does as well. Though sometimes it's just like basic things that you know, answering your phone to the promoter, or if there's a photo shoot, turning up on time. You know, if you're willing, actually that goes a long way. So it's not that you don't have to be kind of a massively skilled communicator, but just showing willing. If your sponsors, you know, asking you to do something, then kind of be visible, remembering to thank your sponsors. There's certain kind of basics which would actually get you a long way in itself if you're a talented fighter as well. You know, because people get a reputation, or that they're really good to work with. Actually, you know, I've got this massive opportunity. I've got a breakthrough media piece with a mainstream newspaper. I'm not going to risk that story on inviting along a fighter who's really excited but might not show up. You know, so you're going to call the person who you know that you can trust to be there and to deliver and do what needs to be done. So it is a job as well. That the PR side of it is a job as much as it's the fighting side. If you want a career in it, I suppose it's.
Yeah, it's those kind of opportunities that athletes need to realise how valuable they are. A lot of athletes who I speak to, not just in MMA, don't understand the value of building their image and building their brand and having an audience of their own. So it's not just an issue of helping them do that; it's also helping them actually see the value in it. And like you say, a lot of fighters are purists and they'll just say, "I don't want to give a comment," or "I'll just do my talking in the cage." Which, if that's who they are and they're not a great communicator, that's fine. I'd rather them be authentic. I'd rather them be authentic than fake. But at the same time, you have to show how you're different. And when you have 400 fighters turn up to IMMAF, you have to stand out from the crowd if you want to gain a largest share as possible of the attention on the event. So if you're just being quiet and just saying, "I'll do my talking in the cage," you're only going to get noticed if you're actually capable of it in the cage. And even then, you might break up. A teammate of mine broke his hand in the first round of his first fight, and that was his tournament done. So you have to look at how you can actually capitalize on it holistically. And that's part of the reason I want to actually help athletes is, firstly, give them advice on how to do it better, but secondly, those guys who are purists and they don't want to invest the time in it, I can sort of take some of that burden off them. But there are fighters who don't think it's their job to do PR, and they're absolutely incorrect in my opinion. At the end of the day, you're an asset to the promotion and you're there to sell tickets. And if you don't have an audience of your own, you're going to be much less capable of doing that. Contrast that with Muhammad Mokayev, for example, who already has an audience of something like 150,000 people. That's a promoter's dream, because he has that attention, he has that audience, and it removes the burden for them. So you have to tell your own stories on social media, because that's the best place to do it, rather than just hoping for the best. And again, a lot of fighters don't understand the game of social media. There's a friend of mine, I won't say who his name is, but he's such a talented fighter and he has such a great future in the sport, but he's so bad at promoting himself. And it frustrates me, because he could tell so many good stories and he could show who he is, but he just doesn't. I don't even think he posted after he won his debut. So if you go on his profile now, you know, he has this post where he says, "I'm fighting on my debut," but you can't find out if he won or not unless you go and Google it on the internet somewhere. So it's little things like that where if someone lands on your profile on social media, you have to tell them who you are. It doesn't say in his bio that he's an MMA fighter. It doesn't even have his full name in his Instagram handle. It doesn't have his picture in his profile picture. It's little things like that that fighters need to realize. That's their brand. When people see their social media profile, that impacts their brand. That impacts people's understanding of who you are. That understands if people are even aware of who you are. It understands if people see you fight in 6 months' time, if they'll remember when they looked at your social media profile 6 months prior. These are the ways that you have to build an audience. And if you don't do that, promoters are going to find it difficult to work with you, but you're also going to find it very difficult to attract those brands to work with as sponsorships. And whether that's you want to earn money as sponsors just as cash, or you want it to send yourself to IMMAF, sponsors need people with audiences, with eyeballs on them. And you have such great exposure in itself, just fighting on a promotion, that if you don't then take control of that for yourself as well, you're really missing out. And these fighters don't understand the amount of money that they will leave on the table if they don't capitalize on it as much as they can. On the flip side, they still have to make sure that they do focus on fighting to some extent. I mean, that is first and foremost what they need to do. Obviously, we've seen fighters in MMA who perhaps have got a little bit distracted, and perhaps that has affected their success. But you need to start building these opportunities for yourself. Social media has completely changed the game for athletes. Traditionally, in the 70s, 80s, 90s, only the top athletes could speak to their audience because they were the ones who were speaking to the press. The press only wanted to generally speak to the top athletes. Whereas now it's completely, the power balance is flipped. You could be a 1-0 amateur and build an audience around mixed martial arts and around who you are outside of mixed martial arts too. And build brand partnerships in those little spaces. But again, athletes don't realize this. They either don't see the value in social media, or they post to social media and just hope for the best. And it absolutely needs to change, because these fighters need help capitalizing on who they are, because they have so much potential to do that and they just don't know how. And it's such a problem that needs to be solved. And like you said, it's difficult for IMMAF to do that, but I'm glad that you guys can see the value in trying to tell the stories of at least some of these athletes as and where you can.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, that's what the obviously the main content focus is at the top end. But I think, to your point as well, it's not really just about them kind of rising up the ladder in the first place, or getting their kind of first sponsorship in ahead of being on the promoter's radar, or getting on the promoter's radar. But I think it's also the longevity of career, because I think you've got fighters who've had very kind of successful profiles that have outlasted say their time with the UFC or at the top of the game, and you've got other guys who've never reached that level but have managed to build a steady income and career as a domestic fighter as well, and have managed to cover their training and doing what they love to do. So, and I think for those guys in particular, then it's the being able to build up your own kind of profile and sell tickets and so on that's kept them going. And I think of people like sort of Colin Freaks, Joe Fletcher, who's like kind of completely unique. I mean, not everybody needs to dress up as a clown, but that his time at UFC, it didn't last long, but he carried on having that audience that followed him, you know, for some time afterwards, because he's a kind of local hero, as it were, or he's like a local public figure, and you have other people who managed to do that. But you know, as well, sort of coming back to basics as well. I don't think we also want to frighten fighters into thinking that they all need to suddenly become extremely extrovert and start calling people out and thinking that's not their personality. But I think being willing, being polished, being professional, and building the relationships as well behind the scenes with the professionals in the industry really helps. So I'd say that also goes to sponsors. So I think sometimes people are really kind of ambitious, that they have their first couple of fights and they want to get an Adidas deal, or they want to get a Nike deal and so on, you know, and they're looking at these corporate organizations where it's actually much more likely to get sponsorship. It might be from one of your local shops that you frequent. It might be like your local butchers. You might have a local mechanic you're really friendly with, and if you're on a local show, actually advertising them on your t-shirt is actually going to be more valuable, you know, for them, and then remembering to thank them on your social media, and keeping loyal to them. And you might also have people at the beginning who might sponsor your mouth guard, but perhaps they are willing to give you cash, but based on what you do, how you use that, how you kind of help promote them, remembering to kind of thank them, keeping in touch with them, you build that relationship, that might turn into a bit of cash, and that cash might grow through your career as that relationship grows. So I think for people who are kind of all up front and out there, certainly just, you know, working quietly with those relationships as well, and valuing the people who support you and around you, and giving that time to it, you know, will also massively help you.
Yeah, I agree. And just having those few local sponsors to begin with, I think there's much more value in that perhaps fighters actually realize, because you can then start to take those results and put them on LinkedIn, for example, where there's business decision makers scrolling through the feed. And if you go, look, this mouthguard company gave me a mouthguard, I gave them this much exposure, got this much engagement on these posts and so on, then there's going to be people looking at that on LinkedIn who are decision makers in marketing departments who then might want to sponsor you, or just show your general sort of social media activity. But again, if fighters are fighters, they're not marketers. They perhaps don't realize that. But there's lots of little ways to create content where you can do that, and also you can actually start to embed those sponsorships in content. If you have a YouTube blog, for example, it can be brought to you by brand, and then so on, and then you just get on with the vlog. It doesn't mean that you have to reach out to either Nike or Reebok or whoever and say, I want to be in your marketing campaign, I want to be on your website. That's where most fighters' minds go when they think of sponsorship deal. They think that they have to be all over all the marketing materials, but it can be so much simpler than that. And what I would also say is it can be so much more diverse than just companies who are sports related. I think most MMA fighters that I see, virtually all of them have a CBD sponsorship. And it's usually CBD or supplementation. I think fighters can go way beyond that. If the example I always use is, for example, if you're a fighter and you have an interest in watches and you collect watches, you could do a weekly vlog showing your process of training each day, of training for a fight, and dedicate 1 minute out of the 15-minute vlog of talking about one watch in your collection. And if you then build a little audience around that little bit of content there, you might then get a watch sponsor on board because they know that you've got a community invested in you who likes the content of you talking about watches. So it doesn't have to just be, I'm an MMA fighter, I promote stuff related to MMA. You can take it as far as you want. I mean, Bryce Mitchell, for example, promotes hunting equipment because he does YouTube vlogs where he shows himself going hunting. So it can be as diverse as you want. You can take that audience to Twitch. And I know a friend of mine who helps a fighter in the UFC out, and she does a lot of streaming on Twitch, and people just pay to watch her react to fights in live time. And she makes money from it, of people just watching her watch fights. And obviously she doesn't show the fights, but it's just literally that simple, and fighters don't realize this. You could, you could start a playlist on Spotify where you say, here's my favorite songs to listen to in the gym this week, and then put that on your Instagram story and say, has anyone got any recommendations for me to add to this playlist, and add them to the playlist. And then you can show who you are and what type of music you listen to, and then maybe a headphones manufacturer gets in touch with you. Maybe Spotify want you to do an exclusive podcast to Spotify. There's a million, you can literally be as imaginative as you want, and you can build out these relationships. But first and foremost, like you said, you have to get people aware of who you are. When you have that attention in the cage or in a promotion, in the lead up to a fight, you have to capitalize on that opportunity. For me, Chelsea. So yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I certainly agree about kind of staircasing in terms of both exposure and in terms of sponsorship. So just by, if you're appearing on smaller kind of blog sites, then you're going to become of more interest to larger media later on, because you've already got a bit of a profile. That larger media are less likely, if they Google you and they can't see you anywhere, to think that you're an anybody. So you kind of can kind of springboard up with the type of media you get, and the same with the type of sponsorship. I mean, you'd have to be doing something kind of really kind of big in terms of numbers, I think, really, for sponsors to be coming to you and headhunting you. But certainly you can build up your case, and it gives you more to work with sponsors as well. But I think, again, coming back to the people who are a bit quieter or less tech savvy as well, just that thing of keeping the relationship with the sponsors. If you've got a good relationship with sponsors that lasts, and you're doing what they ask, and they might bring that media support and help you to promote yourself, and if you're working with them in that way, they like you, you might lose a couple of fights, and they think, or your career might not be going where you want, but they go, look, I like this guy, he's been really good to work with, he's done a lot for us. So there's the relationship as well. So I think that's what I'd like to get across, and I think, as well as all the fantastic creative ideas you have, and I think you could do a lot of wonderful things, but it can be tough to get that cut through. But I think starting small and smaller, modest, and building incrementally. So don't get disheartened if you don't get 500 views on your first, 500,000 views on your first, podcast, for example. If you've got 20 people following your first post, then that's great. Engage with them, build it up, work with this, and that's where you are right at the beginning, at ground zero level, and then you build from there. I think it's both. It's being imaginative and ambitious, but also, I guess, but you're kind of being pragmatic and kind of chipping away, I think.
Yeah. It's a long game of building a brand. Fighters sometimes think that they'll try social media, they'll post a few pictures of them in training, and it doesn't really work, and they kind of get disheartened by it. But I think you have to also show who you are outside of the cage, because every fighter will post a picture of them after training saying, "Hey, great jiu-jitsu practice today, guys." Like, it doesn't really differentiate you in doing that. So start showing, again, I think YouTube vlog's probably the most holistic way of doing it, because you can show your entire process of what you do on a daily basis, to what you do when you wake up, what you eat, how you train, all of that, and what you do outside of the cage, whether you've got family or whether you play other sports or whether you have other interests. And it actually shows how you're different. But the main thing is that you're actually putting content out there in the first place, because if you don't use your voice and you don't communicate, people won't follow you. Like Chael Sonnen said, there's nothing he hates more than when a fighter will be interviewed in the UFC after a fight, especially after a win, and they don't call anyone out. They don't say what they want to do next. They don't really say anything. They just kind of say generic sort of things. And that's your opportunity, where the whole world is watching you, and you can make a moment go viral, or you can make you can send a specific message out. But fighters choose to sit there and say, yeah, he's a really tough guy, etc., etc. It's the same stuff that everyone always says. It doesn't show how you're different. It doesn't give anyone a reason to say, I want to go and follow him on social media, I want to follow his career anymore. Obviously, people might do that because of who you are as a fighter, but not who you are outside of the cage. Look at it as a two-pronged attack, and to actually build a brand. And if you do lose a couple fights and you have a profile on social media, then that's kind of your backup, because if you still have exposure there, companies will still want to work with you, especially now that they can't put sponsors on people's shorts, or they haven't been for the last few years in the UFC anyway. It gives you another avenue to actually build out those relationships, and certainly that can help you in the long term when you retire, because you might then take equity in one of these companies. You might take royalties from products that they sell. They might give you a job as an ambassador, for example, or it just gives you more cash to save up and invest when you're done fighting, because obviously no one can fight forever. So there's just, again, like I keep saying, athletes need to realize that it all starts with them actually starting and making an effort to promote themselves. Even if they're not tech savvy, they don't have to understand how to edit videos. They don't need to understand how to produce a vlog. It can literally just be as simple as talking into your iPhone as your day goes on and putting it on YouTube to show what you're doing when you're not fighting. Again, it's that behind the scenes content that we mentioned before we started recording. People want to see what goes on behind the scenes of the UFC, or behind the scenes at IMMAF, or behind the scenes of a life of a professional or amateur MMA fighter, because there's a lot of fans who don't ever train. They don't ever be involved in the sport, perhaps like we are, and they just consume the sport as fans, and they want to see what goes into it. They want to see more than what actually meets their eye when they just turn on a UFC broadcast, or a Cage Warriors broadcast on BT Sport or whatever. You have to actually find ways to add value and show how you're different. And again, Sean O'Malley is a good example of that. He took his opportunity well with the Contender Series, and not only was it great that he performed well, it was that his knockout, I think, was so good. People were sharing it, and there was all this hype, and he then jumps into the conversations people were having on social media about him. So I think he probably actually searched his name into Twitter and then see who was tweeting about it and go and talk to those people. Go and share all the clips. If BT Sport, if it's UFC Fight Pass, if it's UFC, if it's Fox or ESPN or whoever, go and retweet all of those. And don't retweet it, talk about it. When people are talking about your knockout, go and ask them questions. Say, who do you want me to fight next, for example? and build relationships and create conversations with these people, because it puts your name in front of their face, and it builds a relationship. They're going to screenshot Sean O'Malley tweeting them saying, "Hey everyone, look, Sean O'Malley just tweeted me." They're going to put that in the group chat to all their friends. They're going to put it on their Instagram story. There's just so many little cheeky ways of creating that content to put a name in front of people. And like I say, that exposure that IMMAF offers, these fighters need to realize how to capitalize on it and to make themselves different from the other 400 guys and girls fighting on those shows.
And I'm just on your point about engagement, and I guess it's coming back to that thing again about relationships, but the relationships with the followers and fans, and rewarding that as well, and keeping those conversations alive and giving a value to people commenting and sharing your stuff is such a kind of opportunity that social media now provides. And then I guess at a on more of a kind of physical level, the fighters that I've seen who Paul Daly used to be brilliant at this, he'd kind of organise coaches to bring all his supporters down from Nottingham to his fights, and that sort of thing of actually making your fans almost kind of part of your family. They're part of your team, where it's the guys in the gym you train with, and extending outwards and so on. And that really kind of grows. And we've had guys from abroad who are like that. They come over and then they kind of bring a coach load with them, from Romania or France. That used to happen on Bama a fair bit. And I think, but both on that kind of physical level, but also on the social media level, engaging with people and appreciating their interest in you and that they follow you as well.
Yeah, it definitely shows a level of authenticity when you can actually engage with fans. And obviously engaging fans builds those relationships, firstly from a social media perspective. If people engage with your posts, they're more likely to see them in terms of the algorithm, but also other people are going to see that you're talking to your fans, and then they're going to comment because they want to talk to you. So then you get more engagement, and then again, sponsors want to see that because they want to see as much engagement as possible. And if you have a community who are deeply invested in you as a person and as an athlete, it's then going to that relationship is then going to trickle down to your sponsors, because they're more likely to buy what you are promoting. Or if you produce a course of your own, of here's my jiu-jitsu course, or here's my ebook about nutrition or lifting weights, they're more likely to buy it because they're invested in you. If you just release t-shirts, for example, and I actually did in my last year of university, I did my dissertation on how does an MMA fighter build a brand. And the two things it tested highest was show your life story. In other words, show who you are holistically, not just as a sports person. And secondly, engage with your audience. So those are the two things that, according to my research anyway, that the fighters need to do. That if you do those two things, then you're going to have some level of success. And not everyone's going to be Conor McGregor, and that's fine. Not everyone is. Not everyone can be as witty and as confident and extroverted as he is. But if you just find these little niches to create communities and to build a little fan base, and truly maximize your worth beyond just a couple CBD posts on Instagram, then you're going to see all these new opportunities open up for you, not just in sponsorships, but as I said before, as potentially job offers and things like that. I mean, fighters who get involved in media, like Dominic Cruz, Daniel Cormier, Michael Bisping, they now have positions in the UFC as commentators and analysts, etc. And it builds opportunities that way, because not only were they excellent fighters, but also because they have an audience who they can still talk to through social media. So again, fighters need to just realize the opportunity that exists, and that there too many of them aren't capitalizing on it well enough, or they just don't see the value in it at all. And it's quite sad, because a lot of fighters retire and perhaps fall on hard times a little bit, and they don't have perhaps any opportunities, and obviously takes a toll on you physically, that you need to make sure that you maximize what you can earn inside and out of the cage. And I would say most fighters should probably earn more through Instagram than they do fighting, with the exception of Conor McGregor and perhaps Khabib, perhaps John Jones. I mean, Israel Adesanya probably does. I think he should, because he's so commercially viable. Again, he's one who's shot to fame because not only is he an excellent fighter, but he has a very unique personality. And he makes his own memes, for example. Like, what a fighter does that? He does, and it built an audience for him. It created conversations around him doing that. So yeah, there's definitely a huge opportunity that exists. So we got to say something. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I like the fact that you to mention the biography as well, because that is absolutely foundational, and it's probably the first thing. Well, it is the first thing you do if you've got a fight that you want to promote or a new fighter on board. The first thing you do is you go and reach out to establish their biography, for the press release, to go out to media, and so on. But also once that's out there, it makes it very, very easy for for journalists to write about fighters. Now, I understand not everybody's got much budget for a website, but actually, if you do have a web page, if you've got somewhere where your biography is posted, it could be in your Facebook or whatever. Journalists are very, very under-resourced, but it does mean if people want to write about you and they Google, people will often copy and paste from the internet. So if you haven't got the story you want or your correct story out there, people will take things from other sources. They can be quite lazy or just not have the capacity to come to athletes or PLs directly and ask for details about somebody. So having that kind of up-to-date biographical information, but actually the other a thing relating to that is actually making sure that your Sherdog records and your records on mixedmartialarts.com are up to date and correct, because that's another issue we've had, particularly at IMMAF with the Pro-Am records, is that there'll be a lot of fights that have been wrongly recorded as professional. Now, the fighter's not put that there. Now, either the promoter wrongly reported it, or perhaps the promoter never reported, but somehow these records have got on those sites, and they're very, very difficult to change once they're up there. So if you're wanting to fight at IMMAF, you definitely want to make sure that your amateur fights are recorded as amateur fights. But same goes for your professional profile, because sometimes decisions have been recorded incorrectly. A lot of other kind of details on there which will actually affect your career, or if you're kind of 10-0 but you look like you're 4-0 on Sherdog. Unfortunately, even though it's an independent site and nobody kind of governs it or regulates it, then promoters are going to look at that and they're going to think, well, you had 4 fights, or you had a loss where perhaps you had a win, so on. So I would say that that's something that it's actually really important from an athlete point of view to keep an eye on as well.
Yeah, I mean, amateur MMA in this country has grown hugely since I started training about 5-6 years ago. And one thing that I've noticed is that there's a huge abundance of amateur fighters now. Some of them who want to eventually go professional, some who are just doing it for fun. And it kind of gets caught up in all that noise that there's even a lot of my teammates who I don't know what their records are. And when I look on Sherdog or Tapology, I think it's another one, where I can't find their record, and I think he's definitely had more than 2 fights, but I don't know, he's probably had five or 6, but I don't know what his record is. And if you're an amateur fighter and you want to start building an audience as soon as possible, you need to have those little things correct, because as I said before, that's part of your brand. People will look at that and think that you're a 2-0 fighter when you're actually a 5-1, or you've held a title on a certain show, but it doesn't say that. So you need to take it upon yourself to make sure those little things are correct, to make sure people actually have the right understanding of who you are.
And I guess even working with good promoters or coaches who will keep that stuff up to date, because actually it's really difficult with Sherdog after the event to go back and prove if you've had a fight or if there's an incorrect piece of information, because you'll need to get a letter from the promoter often, and perhaps that was a fly-by-night guy who's disappeared a long time ago. And then trying to find the proof. If there are no journalists there, if nobody wrote about it, if there's no outside record of it, you might never be able to get that corrected. So those are definitely things to keep an eye on, and then kind of speaking to your coach if you don't know how to, to get that kind of corrected. I think that those things you do need to raise. But the best promotions, and the promotions that adhere to good practice, will always make sure that those records are correct.
I think that is something that will probably get better as time goes on. It certainly has in the last 6 years since I've been involved in the sport, and I've kind of watched it grow from, obviously it was still relatively big 6 years ago, but I think it's still at new levels now. But I do think it can grow further, and I do actually think it's being perhaps stunted a little bit by some of the UFC's antics in terms of marketing. And I've, like I said, I discussed this on a recent podcast, but I'll talk about it again in more detail, because for me, their strategies of taking everything UFC off the internet that isn't posted by a UFC account or by an ESPN or BT Sport is taken off. I think that's completely the wrong way to go, because the guest on my last podcast was also invested in basketball, and he said the NBA actually will just let you post anything. They'll let you post anything NBA. They'll let you post NBA compilations, highlights, clips. So it just puts the NBA brand in front of new people, and it's so easy to share things on social media that when people share and you get that word of mouth, you're then being exposed to new eyeballs, not eyeballs who are already having attention on your brand. So I actually think if the UFC allow fans to share, I don't know, short clips and highlights from McGregor's fight in a couple of weeks' time, for example, and he wins by, I don't know, flying knee, then of course people want to share that and let as many people share it as possible, because then there's going to be people who have never watched an MMA fight in their life who will come across that in their feed and go, that was actually quite fun to watch that, and then they want more. And then they'll go to the UFC and start looking at old fights and things. And this is where the Fight Pass being demonetized comes in my opinion, because Fight Pass has performed very poorly in terms of sales. And it doesn't seem to make sense to me to have so much good quality content that tells the story of the UFC. You can watch every single fight in UFC history. You can even watch fights from from other promotions like Cage Warriors, etc. And old Ultimate Fighters, all these behind the scenes content, all the embedded, all the UFC countdowns that you have to pay to watch. Now, if I'm someone who doesn't know much about mixed martial arts or much about the UFC, I'm not going to pay £6 or £7 a month to UFC Fight Pass to watch that content. But if I did consume that content without knowing much about mixed martial arts, it's then much more likely to get me more invested in it, because I can watch the old Ultimate Fighters, I can watch the old fights, I can watch all this content about who all these fighters are. And I think that exposing it to new eyeballs is obviously going to grow the sport, and it's just so sort of restricted, and I think they're actually kind of strangling growth in that sense, because I just struggle to see how people become exposed to the sport when they aren't already when they're not already invested in it or even have an awareness of what it is. And I understand that there's obviously a financial perhaps downside to that, is that they want to be monetizing this content, and they don't want anyone to be shared. Obviously, if it's like McGregor fights and then a week after someone's uploaded the full fight to YouTube, obviously they don't want that. Obviously they don't want people streaming fights in live time. I understand that there is obviously a limit that it has to come to, but I just think that the UFC have more of an emphasis on posting content about that people who already have the context will understand. I think they need to actually put it in front of new people and get new people invested in the sport. And I just don't think that their current strategy actually does that at all.
Well, I would disagree in that they've not successfully engaged outside the MMA audience. I think that they've consistently managed to do that across some wider platforms, mainstream platforms, all around the world, and they've continued to grow. But what content can be made available to fighters will be very much based on the promotions licensing agreements and as you say, their overall commercial strategy. But one thing we're actually looking to do at IMMAF this year is we're investing in a content management system where we will be able to give licensing kind of agreements or arrangements to all the different fighters, so that they will be able to access some of their own fight content to promote on their own social media channels. And that's going to be a big project to set up, so I don't want to promise anything too soon. But there's certainly a number of sports do that already, where effectively the athletes are kind of licensees in a way, and they can have these clips, and then that can kind of sit aside the other broadcast agreements that you have. So we absolutely see the value in that at IMMAF in in providing as much kind of tools and content as possible for fighters to do that. And I think also with events at IMMAF size, obviously it's a different beast from UFC, but when we've got that many fighters, actually nobody's going to tell or promote that fighter's fight and story better than they will on that undercard. It's their followers who are going to want to see it, or it's the people in their nation as well. So you know, we get kind of huge exposure in places like Kazakhstan, but that's all obviously on the Kazakhstan team. You know, the Irish press will focus on the Irish team with this nation's approach. So the more content we can make available to different federations and athletes, you know, massively helps our reach. They don't necessarily all want to know about the top three people in each category if their nations aren't featuring, or it's not people from their team or their club featuring, and so on. So that there is that huge reach you can make where everybody has access to content. As you say, I think that it's definitely the way forward.
Yeah, particularly, and I think when fighters will have access to content that perhaps they don't own but they're allowed to use, and they can then put that on their own social, it allows them to actually own the conversation, because it will then be people commenting on their account, not on the IMMAF account, for example, which is still fine. But I think it will definitely aid them in being, like I say, being able to caption it how they want and share it and distribute it as and when they want to, which will help them, as well as obviously still giving IMMAF exposure, especially if they're taught about how to, you know, tag things properly and perhaps hashtag a little bit better as well, and also having more. I actually think having more of an understanding of how to use social media beyond Instagram will probably help fighters a lot. I think once fighters tap into TikTok and post little fight highlights on TikTok, where obviously there's so much attention and not much content now, that there's so much organic reach there. Again, to reach new people, I think there's actually such opportunities there as well. And I think the UFC should probably tap into that too. I'm sure they already are, to be fair. So yeah, I'm really happy with how this podcast has turned out. I think we're going to wrap it up there. It's been going on for about an hour now, almost on the dot, I think.
Yeah. Lots to say.
That has been. Yeah, once again, thank you very much for your time. I'll leave links in the description of the YouTube video to all IMMAF socials, etc. So if anyone doesn't know what IMMAF is, you can have a look, and obviously get in touch with everything that they're posting. Thank you very much for your time. It's been a great conversation. It's been a pleasure to talk to you. So thank you very much.
All right, thank you. All right.